情况就这样，然后就对吧？有人是在外地不行了，有人像吴伟吧，他本来要给他父亲办什么那个丧事什么事儿，就晚去了，有人就是推迟，就是要参加这个活动推迟了，大概有70、80人，这样，然后呢，大约这14号，大概到15号呢，国宝就找我来了，说17号你不要再去这个6号了，因为今年的这个清明节，我有的朋友外地的，这个天津的、其他河北的要来，我就组织他们来了，然后让二军在门口迎接嘛，才可以进去嘛。他说组织活动，说你不要组织了，最后17号你自己也不要去了。我一看这，我同意了，因为18号有这活动嘛，是要同意的。当然很多朋友还跟我说呢，咱们一块儿去怎么的？我说我这两天不太舒服，不去了。人还以为呢，老严这个让你现出应回来吓怂了，不敢去了。有人不太知道那个情况。
那后来的整个的
18号的早晨，我接上我邻居李普的女儿李玉晓，是我邻居，我们给她做车服。我的妹夫，因为妹夫去这个新加坡的时候，陪我父母去新加坡的时候，跟那个二军呢，他们一家都很熟了，所以呢，他们去了，也代表我们家里吧，我们主持嘛。在路上，朝阳区的国宝，小柳这个警官跟我很熟了，陷入失禁啊，回来之后就找我，说怎么看可以严了你干什么呢？我说有朋友请吃饭，我到吃饭去。说你最好不要出朝阳区，出了朝阳区就不安全了。我说这个一个是我有国境，我知道，市境的时候出到市里的时候，两会的时候出市的进回北京市出境的时候要查一下证件。朝阳区区境我不知道什么地方。第二，我说美国特别不安全，我看到美国回来回到自由中国多舒服的中国，怎么会不安全呢？你吃饭吧，吃完饭还怎么样？吃完我肯定消了食啊，我这人对吧？节食就是什么？就是节食少吃饭，这个吃完饭走，听说旁边有公园什么走走。严老，我们都了解了，你千万不要，你要吃饭是吃饭，吃完饭不要有任何活动。我就没理他，把电话挂了。我从来不主动挂电话的，对吧？电话挂了，也没理他，就过去了。这样就到大概11点半多，就是我约好的7、80人到了。李香鲁也受到委托，听说李香鲁小秘书他就有些我没联系的，像就所谓的3所一会的，就所谓造船小舰队吧，
对
吧？机改所
第一个是中信研究所，
中信国际研究所，农业发展所，然后青年基金学会，来些人，我这个一看，
北京青年经济学会，对，
会长是包同，
对，
就是去了上百人，大约吧，就我们预计嘛，100人左右嘛。后来二军又说了，我们家里现在10点到12点，这边有那个管这个就是负责，到时候这样我就根据他们苏秦的情况嘛，是不是安排座位了？安排了。大约2点钟之后，二军打电话了，说我们人好，你们过来了。我们大概有1、20辆车吧，就好打着双闪的号让我说了，咱们一路走就是有人挡的话，咱们就跟他们说理，不要动什么的。一路走不远，但因为呢，大概有4、5公里10来里路吧，一路两边都是警车，闪着灯开着，但是没关我们的双闪嘛，因为1、20辆车嘛。
有警车在旁边，
路边都有很多警车。到了那个墓园之后，我再说一下，当时二军给我画了个地图，我把图也 copy 了之后，让所有的那个外媒进去之后，在里面的新闻管道进去了。然后我们进去之后，到那个墓地旁边，就被应该是制服警察给拦住了。然后我就说，我们是他亲友，不是当时他们答应了可以有亲友参加。然后我是给二军打电话，二军打电话跟那警官说放我们进去了。我们就浩浩荡进去了。其中有一些华人的媒体没进去，当时就跟我们一块进去了，像美国军的叶兵，说或者他发了一些东西，像日本那个 NHK 的小服务员吧什么，他倒霉，每次都李瑞那个活动还被揪出来，在我们清华校庆，他那人太明显了，他就没让进去。我们进去了，进去之后就是这样。
那就可以找过我很多次，所以我一定要跟老年联系上， 要您华跟我们接受我们采访，
还是可以吧？
啊，对。
后来我听高华林说这个，
对，
我说确实不行
啊，我说这个事情是我在海外不能做任何这样的事情，
因为我准备，对吧？要上次回来之后办了回美证2年，因为疫情了，还有情况我还要写书没写好，我就把今年就是应该是去年嘛，要过来的，所以法庭跟我说了，我说不好意思，对吧？等我这次。
我让他们去找法律
就可以了
啊，因为我说我不行。
对了，后来法庭跟他们见了，是谈了似的。
对，好，我们再回过头来讲这个当时的丧礼，后来的这个处理还顺利吗？还是有没有？
很顺利，经过辩论，但是没有任何干扰。然后就是我主持嘛，我让朋友这个催5年搞司仪，然后我说今天咱们没有尊卑，只有长幼，不管你多大官儿。咱们就要年龄，第一个就是要颠覆，80多岁了。
对，他身体好吗？
身体好，当时身体好。这个第二个就是这个陶思亮，也是80多岁的。
对，
他俩说完之后，
陶思亮身体很不错，
身体很不错，很多精神也好，声音大。然后后来是这个吴伟代表包同不能来。然后我代表戴晴也不能来。然后我说70后。大家一笑，或者是他明白了，就是4、5个一排，4、5一排，就是这样。70后之后就60后，正这个谈着，突然过来一批人，就是有老少的，哭着喊着的，少爷啊，赵大爷什么的。哎，我一看是那个赵家庄的，就是那个河南滑县赵家庄人。我说打仗让他们先来，他们就跪着磕头啊，他们是啊，就是我们是鞠躬嘛，咱们这是声音磕头。完了之后。我给他们深深鞠了一躬，我说感谢赵家庄为中国培养了最优秀的这个
政治家，
领袖领导人。他们走之后就大概到5点左右的都完了，然后二军和我把那些祭品把大家分了，带着放着也不好，放着之后烂了这鸟什么的，然后把这个纸啊都收拾好了之后，最后我们离开的。
那现在的这个。墓碑有没有？你平时后来有没有回去看，或者是了解这个情况？一般民众可以去参观吗？
不行，大概
我当时记得好像是在很远的地方、很深的地方，外表一般你都看不到，照这样码在里面，是不是这样？
我可以说一下这个情况。11月份，天津一些人、河北人想到北京看看，并且因为他们也响应我号召，也声援西装润了。所以跟西装一块儿准备谈，那天就是说好了11月大概是7号去，5号那天晚上正说着呢，3警察到我家去了，这个5个警车5个便车1个警车到家里了，就说你不能搞这活动。这个我送他们走之后，看着都没车了。第二天早上我一出门，我想第二天出门，第二天6号我先出门走了，然后7号你空了，结果一出门就一个车，2个便衣都是便车。严老你去什么地方？就限制我出行。因此我们那个活动就取消了。从那开始后，我就在敏感时期就有警卫保护了。
但是现在一般的民众看不了这个，祭拜不了赵子阳的墓吗？
比不了。1月17号当时吧。是笑话，是赵子阳这个忌日，就第2年的，应该是20年初的时候，就对我限制了。因为我限制，干脆我这与其你们限制我派1个车，还租的车，因为他们不愿意警车派这2个人，我干脆出去吧，我就出去了。大概是出去之后，到外面湖北方向，到1月17号的。
你刚才说是警察派1个车，你到外面去理解。
对，我到敏感时候。这几年都这样，
是吧？
1个车2个警卫，然后监视我。有一天
也可以说陪同你嘛。
是啊，也是保护我吧。严老，不好意思，今天我们车限行，我坐你的车行不行？我什么事？你们监视我坐我车，我大教授，我这个车不值钱，我这个我当车夫这个工时费很高啊，别这样。就没办法，说我们不好意思，我们不能派警车，小区太影响了。他们租的车，北京租车。北京私家车，这6天有1天限行，他碰巧那个限行，我出去他跟着我，这样。
但是你们到外地去，我想问的细一点是，他们出钱，你不要出钱。
他要出钱陪着，我不干。我每次我跟他们 6年了吧，没能出一分钱，没吃那么一顿饭，什么都没有。
不是他们免费招待，是你自己出钱。
他们明示今天不能活动，暗示你要愿意去，我们可以陪你也可以，我们给你报销也可以，但是我
不要他们报销，
不要，对吧？
那你们住什么地方，吃什么就都随便。
那我自己一个人呢，我跟到湖北的朋友，我讲的情况呢，然后到湖北之后，因为湖北我跟他们这个去以前也开过这个读书见面会啊，有些朋友让我再去聊聊啊，这个我在大约17号中午，那个飞机又飞到天津了，正好那个到北京的飞机不太方便，到天津好，中午21就给我们有私信就说了，我们去了，现在在那个回来畅子的饭馆吃饭呢，那里面上面种很多树都管得很严，说那个我这本书写了，他我的全部他我的留话我全部说了，根本都看不到啊，左钻右钻在缝里钻过去了，然后那边还有什么这个要查身份证什么的，还是查完身份证之后给小牌牌，说我们家里人根本不理进去了，而其他人说比如什么广东驻办公室主任，驻北京办事的，还有什么老白他们，就是原来紫阳办公室的几个人啊，李书条、李什么，反正都去了，但是带个牌不理他。那里面就说的跟监狱似的，周围严实似的。就过去我们下面一眼看见了，他们故意找个高地方，找个比较高的地方啊，这一能看，现在什么都看不见，周围种满了树，然后还有北京市民政局的牌，要求什么要刷脸呐，要什么这个证件才可以进去，他就说可以，所以根本就进不去了。
哎呀，这个实际上历史已经过去了这么长时间，真正了解赵紫阳啊的这一代人也老了，
对，
为什么还搞得那么紧张，对吧？
你看我在回国定居之前，每年回去中国3、5个月，我住酒店里，那些服务员、经理都不知道谁是赵紫阳，谁是胡耀邦，那胡耀邦都没解禁的，64更不知道，完全是这个，
但是他们还是那么紧张，对，
欢迎来到6度解析，我们为您带来 VOA 独家报道。穿越美国南部边境的中国移民表示，他们踏上了逃离中国专制统治、寻求美国梦之旅。但挑战在到达后并没有结束，有些人决定返回中国，而另一些人则别无选择。去年4月，夏雨在2个月内穿越了10多个国家后抵达美国。西亚是一名40多岁的中国人，他要求使用假名，这样他就可以更自由地用美国之音普通话谈论他的旅程。他说，在前往美国边境的路上，他所有的财产都被偷了，他的美国梦没有实现。在移民拘留期间，他未能通过寻求庇护者的可信的恐惧面试。根据美国海关和边境保护局的数据，2023财年52700名中国移民在没有有效入境签证的情况下抵达美国边境，是2年前的2倍多。他们中大约一半人进入美国南部边境的某个地方，在那里他们被边境保护局特工逮捕并寻求庇护。通过筛查并确定他们有可信的理由害怕酷刑、迫害或返回自己国家的个人，可以留在美国，在移民法院审理他们的案件。夏在美国的拘留所待了几个月，因为他被驱逐出境，最终于去年8月降落在上海浦东机场。进入中国海关后，他被罚款71美元，并不得不签署一份文件，承认他在非法进入另一个国家后被驱逐出境的罪行。他的护照被没收，并被告知他将被禁止离开该国3年。他家乡的公安局也向他询问了他在美国领土上遇到的人。 他们要求我删除我的外国社交媒体应用程序和外国联系人，他告诉美国之音。然后他们告诉我，我不要联系这些人，因为我会被欺骗。下说，他认为他的微信账户正在受到监控，以防止他煽动他人非法移民。他说，甚至不留在美国就花了数万美元，没什么好吹嘘的。他宁愿不再提及他的经历。33岁的王忠伟来自中国安徽省，现在住在洛杉矶。自5月进入美国以来，洛杉矶一直是移民的倡导者。许多已经越过边境或试图越过边境的中国人向他寻求建议。王告诉 VOA， 虽然大多数穿越边境的人留下来，但有些人因为孤独、欺骗或家庭压力而返回。王的朋友刘明来自四川省，于2023年下半年来到美国。刘31岁，先是在洛杉矶待了1-2个月，然后搬到纽约找工作。经过长时间的等待，他为一位中国老板找到了一份工作，但薪水并不好。1月份，刘的老板拒绝付钱给他，所以他别无选择，只能报警。第2天收到工资后，刘立即去了机场，给王发了信息：我现在在机场，即将回中国，我不喜欢这里，如果命运有的话，再见。3月，当王再次联系他时，他发现刘在进入中国时使用了自助服务亭，甚至没有接受政府工作人员的采访。几个月内，刘回到了他以前所知道的中国生活。我现在在家乡的一家餐馆工作，我工作了8个小时，食物超级好。他通过 WhatsApp 告诉王，我曾经在美国的一家餐馆不停地工作12个小时。在那里，我感到无聊和孤独，但我在家里过着充实的生活。有一次，当他在美国生病时，他担心死在异国他乡，他还抱怨不能在那里见到女人。我不后悔去美国旅行，刘继续说。然而，在生病时，他担心死在异国他乡，而且他发现很难见到女人。我在现实生活中看到的与我在网上看到的不同，他总结道。美国既有好事也有坏事。张琳30多岁，被要求使用别名来保护自己的隐私。他形容自己是一个双重遗憾的人。他首先后悔来到美国，现在他后悔回到中国。越过美国边境，张在洛杉矶找到了一份按摩治疗师的工作，因为他接受了培训。在那里，他每天赚大约150美元，这对一个无证移民来说是一大笔工资。但仅仅1个月后，他就回到了中国。现在他在家乡经营着一个足疗。他说，在美国有很多我不习惯的事情，我很孤独，我非常想家，所以我冲动地回来了。张说，当他去美国时，他希望赚很多钱，让他的家人成为家乡邻居羡慕的对象。但现在，在回到中国后，他在海关面临12小时的审讯，但没有受到任何处罚。他说，他对自己冲动的返回决定感到遗憾。我家乡的生活真的很无望，张说，并补充说，他希望再次非法去美国。当你出去时，你会意识到外面的世界是不同的，你的思想被打开了。这篇文章主要涵盖了中国移民穿越美国南部边境的经历和挑战，以及他们在美国生活的体验和观点。以下是对文章内容和观点的总结。移民的动机。文章指出，这些中国移民穿越边境是为了逃避中国的专制统治，追求美国梦，或是避免国内政治和经济不确定性。抵达美国的挑战。移民在途中经历了财产被偷、美国梦未能实现等困难。在美国边境被捕后，一些人未能通过庇护申请，被驱逐出境。移民数量的增加。文章引用了美国海关和边境保护局的数据，指出2023年中国移民抵达美国边境的数量激增，达到52700人，是2年前的2倍多。移民的体验和选择。文中列举了几个个人案例，描述了他们在美国生活的经历和选择。有些人因为孤独、工作不顺利或家庭压力而选择返回中国，而另一些人则选择留下。对美国生活的观点。一些移民认为在美国工作艰难，生活孤独，与在家乡的生活相比感觉无聊。但也有人认为在美国工作机会更多，生活更丰富多彩。后悔与遗憾。 一些移民后悔来到美国，而另一些人后悔返回中国，感到自己做出了冲动的决定。总的来说，文章呈现了中国移民在穿越美国边境，在美国生活和选择回到中国的经历和感受。这些经历展示了移民在寻求更好生活过程中面临的挑战和复杂性。中国移民的边境穿越与生活选择、挑战与抉择。在全球化的时代，越来越多的人选择跨越国界，追寻更好的生活。中国移民穿越美国边境，不仅仅是为了逃离国内的政治和经济不确定性，更是为了寻求一个更为自由、机会更多的国度。然而，他们的旅程并非一帆风顺，一旦踏上了这条不归路，面对的挑战和抉择将成为他们生活的一部分。逃离与期望，穿越边境的决定。中国移民踏上穿越美国边境的旅程，通常是出于对中国专制统治下局限的不满和对美国所代表的自由和机会的期望。他们或许已经听闻了在美国可以追求个人梦想的机会，或是渴望摆脱在国内面临的政治迫害和经济压力。因此，他们做出了一个艰难而决绝的选择，踏上了穿越千里边境的旅程。挑战与抉择。在美国的生活。抵达美国后，中国移民往往面临着前所未有的挑战，他们可能会被拦截、被驱逐出境，甚至在边境遭受盗窃和剥夺。即使成功进入美国，他们也会面临语言、文化、工作和生活习惯的巨大差异，这些都成为他们在新环境中融入的障碍。一些人可能因为孤独、工作不顺利或家庭压力而选择放弃美国之梦，选择回到中国。然而，也有人选择留下，继续努力适应和追求自己的梦想。后悔与觉醒，回到中国的抉择。对于那些选择返回中国的移民来说，这或许是一个充满复杂情感的决定。他们可能后悔离开了家乡，重新面对国内的生活可能会让他们感到无助和失落。然而，也有人意识到，在美国的生活并非想象中那样美好，重新回到熟悉的环境中，反而带来了安心和舒适感。有些人会面对海关审讯和处罚，但即使如此，他们也感到遗憾，自己做出了冲动的决定，不再能轻易踏上这条路。结语：中国移民在穿越美国边境，在美国生活和选择回到中国的经历，展现了追求自由和机会的人类追求，也凸显了跨越国界所面临的困境和抉择。无论他们最终选择留下还是返回，他们都在这条旅途中经历了成长和觉醒，为自己的生活和未来做出了不同的选择。这些经历不仅仅是个人的，更是整个时代的缩影，让我们反思和思考人类社会的未来方向。
观众朋友们好，欢迎大家来到本期的思想先驱报节目现场。近期在谈到中国经济的时候我们可能会发现这样叫做冰火势不两容的两种论调如果你是与一些这个西方的专家来聊，或者呢是与一些接受西方训练的经济学者来聊，可能他们会对于北京现在的政策取向非常的惊讶。比如按照西方的经济理论，在现在出现经济下行的时候，北京呢可能会利用两会的时机通过货币宽松消费刺激或者是对于房地产进行大幅救市这样的方式，来对于中国的经济进行某一种提振。但是如果你要是与中国的经济学者聊，或者是中国的政策学者聊，他们往往对于这样的救助方式不以为然。相反包括中国领导层内的一些经济官僚，往往把注意力集中在通过新技术让中国工业进行转型上。特别是现在在美国技术封锁的背景下，他们最强调的一个词叫做关键技术自给自足，当然其中最具代表性的就是半导体。那最近我们也看到中国向之前的半导体产业基金是增加了270亿美元的投入， 同时啊，今年的预算来看，国家科技方面的预算是大幅增加了10%。那么为什么会出现对于中国经济到底应该怎样走这样水火势不两容的看法呢？我们首先来看西方这一边的观点啊，战略与国际研究中心的中国经济专家甘斯迪在之前的2月就曾经发布这样一份中国经济报告。他看到中国经济现在有多个薄弱点，实际的增长啊似乎比官方的数据还要低。另外，我们看到已经出现了通货紧缩的现象，整个房地产市场还没有企稳，而股市的状况也十分不明朗。但是北京方面啊，对于西方的这一种宏观经济学，往往啊没有多大的兴趣。这样的一种学说，更多的是处理于叫做管理需求，或者叫做提振需求、平稳需求这样的一个模式。而北京的经济学者更加关注于的是产业政策以及供给面的相关的支持。而两会之后，我们看到重要的数据似乎支持了北京对于中国经济状况不需要近期提振需求这样的看法。之前大家担心可能会出现通货紧缩，因此需要对于消费者的这样的一个消费需求进行大幅的提振。而如果我们看到核心 CPI 价格指数在2月份的时候啊，已经是同比上涨了1.2%。所谓的核心 CPI 呢，是去掉了食品价格。那之前我们也看到，整个食品价格呢是对于整个 CPI 有比较大的这样的一个拖累啊。那么这主要是由于过去的1年啊，那么猪肉的价格啊，受到猪瘟以及疫情的影响呢，是出现了比较偏离正轨的上涨。换句话说，北京方面认为短期内进行需求刺激，其实并没有这么急迫。根据来自亚洲时报的有关报道，现在我们看到中国的领导层更关注到的是以人民币计算的出口额，这样的一个数字在过去的1月到2月期间呢，是同比增长高达10%。这个数字在中国领导层看来仍然是相当可喜的，这也为中国的高科技产业提供了非常大的支持，尤其是太阳能电池板、电动车啊、电子设备啊，包括电信设施等等等等。来自亚洲时报的报道特别提供了这样的一组数据，就是中国现在已经安装的工业机器人的数量已经超过了全球其他地方的总和，占到世界总数的52%。而在北京领导层看来，正是这样自动化和规模经济的整合，让中国现在可以比世界上任何地方的竞争对手都能够成本更加低廉的生产这一些太阳能电池板、电动汽车以及其他的关键产品。而更重要的是，现在中国的领导层似乎有这样的一种自信，就是中国的工业化，包括5G 啊、5.5G 啊、未来的6G 啊，以及人工智能在应用领域啊，这对于中国还仅仅只是一个开始。未来中国可能会突破更多前沿性的技术，甚至核聚变发明等等等等。那么我们看到，科学预算这一次增加，似乎更体现了领导层要在尖端科技以及突破方面走在世界前列的这样的雄心。来自亚洲时报的报道啊，特别引述2项重大举措。首先是开发热核聚变，这可能成为未来世界的主要能量来源，以及中国现在要建设世界上最大的粒子对撞机，可能要吸引成千上万的国际顶级科学家到中国来落足。中国现在呀，特别重视的就是这一种科学和工业能力相整合的这样的一个方向的发展。来自亚洲时代的报道，昨天呢特别注意到，在去年底的时候，有一个由中国核能公司领导的财团成立。那么财团正是希望能够在科学能力以及工业能力方面有所整合，希望能够在2030年前建造可以生产能量反应堆的这样的核聚变技术研究。这个财团到底有哪一些组成部分呢？根据来自亚洲时报的报道，总共呢是有25家中央政府拥有的企业以及研究机构，包括一些国有的能源和钢铁公司，比如我们熟知的国家电网啊、三峡呀，以及宝钢啊、武钢啊等等等等等等。 这是一个方面，就是北京领导层相信中国现在已经在工业生产能力方面走在了世界前沿，并且希望在未来通过加大科技的投入，在科技和工业能力整合方面再有所进益，甚至是形成某一种世界首屈一指的垄断点。另外，我们看到在高级粒子物理学领域，现在有关于电子对撞机的建设也是一个非常重要的这样的一个科学前沿。大家认为呢希格斯工厂所谓的这样的一个工厂往往呢需要耗时10几年甚至20几年才能够完成，而中国现在呢是已经投入了超过50亿美元的成本在这样的一个领域进行发展。看来与其关心眼前的供需问题，领导层仍然是把目光放在了所谓未来的第4次工业革命上。这是不是意味着眼前的问题就不重要呢？也不能这么讲。但是现在党的领导层，中国的这个叫中央决策层与其在说给大家发消费券，帮助整个股市回升，帮助消费者能够进一步的获得更多的财富，现在他们对于需求的提振主要集中在政治动机和政治兴趣上。那我们知道所谓的贫富差距，其实从1979年、1980年代出现大规模的城市浪潮的时候就已经有所拉大了。而所谓的共同富裕，又是习近平的关键政治议程。在这样的背景下，我们看到，对于北京、上海、广州、深圳以及这样一些1线城市的中国人而言，他们很多的生活水平和生活方式已经与工业国家或者叫做发达国家的水平比较类似了。但是中国的大部分地区的生活水平还远远落在后面。因此，现在即使是在所谓的需求侧的政策方面，北京的目标呢，更多的是集中在如何缩小城乡和区域差距这一边。即使说要进行更多的建设，进行更多的对于需求侧的扶植，往往也是集中于2、3线城市，比如低保比如医疗等等等等。而未来一段时间更强调的基础设施投入，可能更集中在扩大高铁网络，以及2、3线城市的比如廉租房改造、城中村改造这样的基础设施，来在提振需求的同时，也能够把资源和机会在地区之间进行一次重新的分配，那么获得更多的政治上的利益。那我们知道之前呢，我们看到了一些解决方案，比如说像卫星城新城区整个大型城市的我们叫做扩中心化等等等等。但是从2023年一直到2003年这20年间，我们看到仍然是有很多地方的大都市继续面临着人口拥挤以及资源供不应求的状况。根据中国官方的统计数据，现在拥有200万人口的我们叫做中大型城市是从30几个增加到了72个。那么一方面呢是体现了中型城市的增加，另外一方面我们也看到整个城市化的进程仍然需要中央政府的发力，而现在这可能成为未来一段时间的重要资源。至于说房地产公司，那么在西方看来房地产往往是金融危机出现问题的重要前兆。美国历史上重要的几次金融危机，往往都有我们叫做房地产引动了银行系统，银行系统再传导向实体经济，实体经济再影响到就业以及更广泛的民生问题。但是在中央政府的一些顾问来看呢，这一次国家恐怕是不会投入多少资源来救助房地产这样一些公司的。为什么呢？是因为北京领导层认为这一些公司在城市化浪潮中已经吃尽了红利。比如我们看到深圳市中心的一套房屋的价格，可能比旁边的四川成都的完全相同的房屋价格要高出10倍。换句话说，这一次即使是在需求侧有所提振，往往可能会集中在对于执政党政治利益有直接关联的领域，比如贫富差距以及2、3线城市的基本民生问题。而至于大城市，至于这一些巨头性的房地产公司，可能会成为人为刀俎，我为鱼肉，菜板上的鱼肉，为这一次中国经济下行买单。 来自亚洲时报的文章啊，特别介绍到了现在中央领导层对于未来经济的部署布局，以及对于面向未来工业化和科学整合的思路。这在很多西方经济学者看来呀，恐怕是并不入流的一套方案。特别是他们非常担心的是，眼下的不管是一线城市还是二线城市也好，商业活力还远远没有恢复，而西方投资者对于中国也远远不像之前的10年、20年这样感冒了。不管是心智发展力，还是面向未来的科学创造，在短期内很少可能可以改变这一种信息局态，以及对于中国就业更广泛需求面的担忧和阴云。而如果产业政策或者所谓发展心智生产力的计划没有能够成功的话，竹篮打水一场空，可能对于未来的经济生产力的提振也没有什么效益，更不要说基础设施建设，其中的腐败以及冗余问题，正是造成过去几十年中国生产扭曲畸形的重要原因和基础。那么对于中国未来到底应该怎样走，中国是否能够走出这一轮经济危机，我们刚才是介绍了2种完全不同的思路。到底您更认同哪一种思路？也欢迎您在节目下方告诉我们。在今天的思想先驱报中我们还有一个话题，就是为大家介绍所谓的国家资本主义，或者叫做产业政策。一提到产业政策大家可能想到的是中国制造2025心智生产力等等等等，往往认为像一个自由市场中完全注入政府的权利，可能会造成冗余、腐败以及资源的浪费。而美国呢，大家更认为是一个完全基于自由市场和企业家精神的体系。但是在最近一期彭博社的 Outlots 这样的一期播客节目中就采访到了一位历史经济学家，他就研究了美国一位国父汉密尔顿的理论。在他的研究看来，其实政府的角色从开国之初就被大幅的低估了。实际上在各个阶段，从汉密尔顿时代到现在，政府在美国的经济发展中都扮演了一个不但关键而且十分积极的角色。说到汉密尔顿，大家可能首先想到的是近期爆红的音乐剧《汉密尔顿》，但是汉密尔顿其实还有一份重要的文件资料，叫做制造业报告。其中他特别分析了美国在建国之初经济面临的问题，看到了美国政府可以通过提供资金、制定政策、建立关税壁垒这样的方式，对于早期的经济发展进行推动。在汉密尔顿看来，这一种干预主义的做法并非是对资本主义的背离，反而是美国资本主义可以取得成功不可或缺的一部分。而后在作者的研究中，他也发现，不管是美国、德国还是后来的日本，整个国家政府在工业化的过程中其实都发挥了决定性的作用。换句话说，汉密尔顿的这一份制造业报告可以说是对自由市场理论的一个重要的修正，特别是对于亚当·施密在《国富论》中的一些观点。汉密尔顿就直言不讳对于亚当·斯密的观点提出了批评。他认为，如果要实现经济的现代化特别是实现关键的工业化，光有市场机制是不够的。那么他提出的措施就包括保护性的关税财政补助政府来投资基础设施、教育研发等等等等。在那个时候的背景下他主要提出这一些想法的原因是，美国本身的工业还非常的稚嫩，而当时与美国形成竞争的欧洲的一些国家往往已经有成熟的工业体系。同时他认为美国经济的多元化以及工业化早期的发展，对于美国乃至全球的未来都可能产生非常重要的后果。而后汉密尔顿的思想也的确是影响到了日本以及德国一系列的这样的一个政策制定者。不过说到汉密尔顿思想的来源，我们就必须要提到英国早期的重商主义。那么作者研究发现，英国早期的重商主义政策其实正是汉密尔顿提及有关工业政策的重要来源和基础。所谓的重商主义，对于殖民地 早期的经济发展实施了重大的限制，而这在汉密尔顿看来就成为了美国追求独立和经济自主的重要的这样的一个前置性的因素。那么英国政府为什么要限制包括美国在内的殖民地的制造业的发展呢？就是希望保证自己的商品能够在殖民地的市场上有比较大的占有率。而这样的做法当时是极大的禁锢到了美国这个英属殖民地的这样的一个经济增长的动因。而现在我们在谈到后来的美国革命的时候往往会看到政治理念的争论。大家还记得不能代表就不能收税这样的一个口号，我们在高中学历史都曾经学到过。但是在作者的研究就发现经济因素同样对于美国革命的动因起到了关键性的作用。当时美国的制造业者主要集中在北方，还有南方的这一些农业生产主，往往都看到了，如果美国能够从英国独立出来，可能会取得更大的经济利益。北方呢是希望摆脱英国对于美国的工业限制，发展本土的制造业；南方则是担忧英国之前对于整个殖民地的政策会限制甚至是废除奴役制，因此威胁到他们的经济利益。在这样的一个情况下，我们也必须看到，当时美国南北方的经济结构是存在着非常明显的差异的。南方呢是主要依赖于农业以及奴役劳动，主要是生产棉花和烟草等等等等。当时的北方后来是发展了更多的家庭农场和手工业制造。那么我们也知道，这成为了南北方分裂和内战的一个重要的背景。但是在革命时期不管是在革命战争时间还是在革命战争之后，汉密尔顿观察到美国政府有一个重大的问题，就是联邦政府的权力过小，没有办法有效的调配资源，甚至没有办法统一指挥军队。这就凸显了有一个强有力的中央政府在保护国家安全和经济发展中的必要性。因此当时汉密尔顿也认识到如果美国需要维持独立，如果美国防止再次沦为殖民地或者被外国势力重新征服，就必须要快速转型成独立自主的以制造业为基础的经济体系。提到独立自主这个词我们可能也想到了现在中国方面所提出的一些口号。而在汉密尔顿看来，政府必须要进行规划和引导，才能够实现这一些方面。当时汉密尔顿是美国的财政部长，作为财政部长他是提出了一系列财政和经济政策，包括建立国家银行把这个债务联邦化，提高关税等等等等。后来可以说为整个美国现代经济的基础设施奠定了基础。但是后来汉密尔顿的这样的一个以国家化推动制造业的发展的理念，也是遭遇了很多政治和意识形态上的挑战。但是后来的事实似乎证明，汉密尔顿的所谓的国家支持论中，至少有相当一部分是值得借鉴，甚至是被沿用至今的。说到沿用至今，我们就要提到美国的邮政条款。美国的邮政条款赋予了联邦政府在基础设施建设方面的权利，特别是在运输网络建设上，不仅仅是对于邮政服务的发展，也为整个美国经济的一体化、降低运输成本提供了支持。美国有很多著名的道路和运河项目都是在邮政条款下所建立的。而同时在邮政条款的敦促下，政府也是降低了美国国内市场的内部的壁垒，促进了整个国内市场的形成和整体的发展。那么这一位作者不仅仅是对于美国这个汉密尔顿这样一位国父进行了重新的研究，对于他的思想理论进行了相应的整理，同时他也梳理了早期国家支持的产业政策对于美国经济发展的影响，甚至对于整个世界经济哲学的影响。我们一直认为美国是在自由资本主义市场之上发展起来的，但是读过这一本书之后，可能你对这样的看法也会有所修正。今天我们特别推荐给大家的就是这样一部有关于汉密尔顿美国产业制造政策之父的观点的这样的评价。那么在随后您将看到的来自彭博社 Outlets 这一段播客节目中，我们可以看到主持人对于这一位作者的采访，他也对于这一本书中的细节进行了更多的介绍，希望对你有所帮助。好了，以上就是本期思想先驱报的全部内容，下期我们再会。
Did you ever see the musical Hamilton?
No, I didn't. Can I just say, listeners, Joe has already asked me this question in preparation for the podcast. So and he actually did a really amazing summary of all of Hamilton. You didn't sing it or rap it, which I think you should have done, but it was pretty good.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think, can I just say, like, I actually did like it at the time that I saw it. And I still, like, if I'm not in the car with my kids, like, it's not bad to put on. I feel like liking Hamilton, it's a little cringe now. It's very, like, so, you know, very
It's
Obama
too mainstream for you?
You know, it's like a little 2010s. It's a little bit like we sort of moved on. But, like, it is an entertaining show. It's not the worst. As far as musicals go, many of which are very bad, in my opinion, it's not the worst one.
It definitely kind of vaulted Hamilton. It feels weird to say this now, but I guess it vaulted him into the public consciousness. But it's interesting because as far as I understand, and here I have to confess that I never really did U.S. history. When I was in high school, I was in Austria and then Japan. So this is a big blind spot for me. But when I think of Hamilton now, I think of like the Federalist Papers, maybe the financial system.
Yeah.
But it turns out there's this huge body of Hamiltonian thought that is all about the real economy and I guess manufacturing, industrial policy development.
Yeah, and this is not at all I haven't read the Ron Chernow biography, but it's certainly not in the musical. And basically the play or the musical, like sort of, you know, he has these rap battles with Thomas Jefferson. And
Joe, summarize the rap battles.
And, you know, obviously, Thomas Jefferson is a defender of the system of slavery. And what's important is like doing the planting. And all you guys do up north is like finance. But we're supposed to be on the side of finance as the audience and this and set it, you know, first Secretary of the Treasury. But as you point out, there is much more to Hamilton than just this sort of like dichotomy of the slave owning plantation owners in the South and then those of us up in New York City who just do numbers and finance.
Yeah. And I guess the other thing to point out is obviously industrial policy is having a moment since the pandemic. And we've seen various steps and projects from the Biden administration, including the IRA and things like that. So it's kind of interesting to go back in time and consider the American historical Hamiltonian roots of progressive industrial policy.
Well, and this comes out every time we do an episode, like on the CHIPS Act or the Inflation Reduction Act, et cetera. Someone says, well, you know, industrial policy is not this new thing in America. And they say, we did this in the past. And they sort of leave it there. But I think it's a good idea to like actually start exploring some of those historical roots of the role that the federal government can and has played in the past in channeling industries, channeling capital, channeling real physical resources, promoting domestic manufacturing. Because everyone says, oh, we always did this in the past, but we sort of have to talk more about what that past looked like.
Yes. So this is the episode for anyone who has ever said that statement. The U.S. has a long history of industrial policy.
We're going to go back to the very beginning. Well, I'm really excited about our guest. Like I said, I never read the Ron Chernow biography, but I did read Radical Hamilton, Economic Lessons from a Misunderstood Founder. The author, Christian Parenti, is joining us. He is a professor in the John Jay Economics program that's housed within the CUNY system of New York City. So, Christian Parenti, thank you so much for coming on Odd Lots.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
I loved your book, but did you watch the musical?
I did not watch the musical. I don't really like musicals, so I didn't see
I have a complicated view towards musicals myself, so I totally get that. Why did you think another Hamilton book was necessary?
Well, I did read the Chernow biography, and while reading it, there's a mention of the report on the subject of manufacturers, which is Hamilton's magnum opus in many ways, and it is an argument for and a blueprint for planning to drive a transition from an agrarian-based economy to a manufacturing-based economy. And that was very interesting to me, and I tried to find more on it, and there really wasn't that much in the literature. So this book actually began by mistake almost. The idea was to republish the report on the subjects of manufacturers, and I would do an introduction, and then the introduction turned into a book. Along the way, I was like, oh, we'll have it as an appendix, but it just, it became an effort to fill in the gap around Hamilton's thinking about the real economy and about what we would call industrialization or industrial policy, but what they called manufacturers.
Why do you think that Hamilton's legacy is so much more focused, I suppose, on the Federalist Papers, on maybe building the financial system versus the paper that you just mentioned? Because again, I will confess that before I read the book, I had never heard of that particular piece of Hamilton writing.
Part of it has to do with the fact that the report on manufacturers was controversial from the beginning. And there was pushback from the beginning, and there has been pushback against the kinds of policies that it advocated all the way through. So it just sort of dropped away. And there is a mythology about American capitalism which tries to minimize the role of government in that story. And so that's why we had previously hadn't thought sufficiently about the report on the subject of manufacturers, because it clashes with prevailing notions about how capitalism works, which is that it's all about free enterprise and entrepreneurs and free trade. And in fact, what the story of Hamilton's report on the subject of manufacturers shows, and I think you can see it throughout world history, is that successful capitalist industrialization pretty much always involves an activist state that intervenes, gets prices wrong, and helps drive an economy towards manufacturing. In fact, in the beginning of the report on the subject of manufacturers, Hamilton launches a critique of Adam Smith. Hamilton supposedly wrote a whole treatment of Smith's Wealth of Nations, but that's been lost to us. But that's why. And I studied with Alice Amsden, who's passed away, who was an economist at the New School many, many years ago. And she wrote the definitive book, or sort of the first big book, on Korean industrialization. And it was all about this. And so that really interested me. And the similarity, the fact that the U.S. at the beginning of the story of American capitalism is the story of a developmentalist state. And I've been interested in those questions as they appear in the global South.
It's funny you mentioned Korea's development, because we did an episode, Joe, I don't know if you remember, many, many years ago about the development of the K-pop and entertainment industry in South Korea, and how much of it was actually driven by a conscious government effort, where a lot of people think even this kind of creative industry develops naturally. But in the case of South Korea, there was a lot of support.
I actually have Alice Amsden's book, Escape from Empire, The Developing World's Journey Through Heaven and Hell, on my bookshelf. I need to read that book. Yeah. What were the economic conditions in the U.S. at the time, or I guess was it the U.S., in the colonies at the time, that Hamilton was looking at, that he said, okay, we need to talk about a government role in manufacturing?
Yeah. To some extent, this gets into why the revolution occurred. And British mercantilism was putting very explicit and onerous restrictions on economic development in the United States. For example, hat makers in the U.S. couldn't have more than 2 apprentices, right? There was a robust fur trade, and beaver pelts were much in demand in Europe for making hats. And the U.S. had a nascent hat industry, and British economic policies made it illegal for it to develop, as much as it could. Similarly around, iron smelting, iron could only be processed to a certain level. So there were very real restrictions on the development of manufacturers, because Britain held these 13 colonies as colonies. And so they wanted these colonies as a market. So that's one of the reasons, actually, that northern kind of nascent manufacturing interests gravitate towards revolutionary cause. There's all sorts of interests, right? I mean, there's like the rhetoric of freedom is appealing to the working classes. In the slave South, there was fear that the British Empire was going to restrict slavery, because there was the Somerset case in 1773, I think it is, in which a British planter in Jamaica, comes back to England with an enslaved person, and that person gets in touch with abolitionists who say, slavery is illegal in England, even though it's legal in the colonies. This goes all the way through the English court system, and it is ruled that, yes, you may be enslaved in Jamaica, but as soon as you set foot in England, you are free. This sent shockwaves of fear throughout the elites of the South. One of the richest people in the British Empire was a South Carolina slave owner, Henry Lawrence, who later is actually president of the Continental Congress. And he felt threatened, like, well, now I can't travel to England with my chattel slavery, my servants. What's next? Maybe they're going to come after slavery entirely, because there was a movement also in the northern colonies against slavery. So there's a whole variety of causes that coalesce and drive many of the colonists, though not all, to embrace revolution and independence. The economic conditions, getting back to your question, were pretty underdeveloped. Agriculture was predominant. In the South, the economy was dominated by large planters. Most white Southerners didn't own slaves, but almost half did own slaves, but most slaves were owned by a small group of men who owned many, many slaves and much land. So that was the Southern economy. And in the North, you had small family farms, and there'd almost been a kind of re-peasantization in that many of these farms were quite self-sufficient and had only a tenuous connection to the cash economy. The war, the Revolutionary War, will actually drive many of those northern tier farmers into the cash economy because they have to pay taxes and they have to come up with cash. So, and in those northern family farms, there were small craft productions. There was home-based productions, generally, like building along with your self-sufficient farm. You maybe produce a little extra dairy for the market, but then also in the winter you create barrel staves or shoes or something like that. So there was this workshop-based manufacturing. There are no American banks. And the 13 colonies are all independent. There's no transportation network. So after the war, it's an absolute mess. And Hamilton's concern is first and foremost national security. He says, we're going to be reconquered and recolonized if we don't have a strong army and navy and state. And the only way we can afford that is if we transition as quickly as possible to a manufacturing-based economy. And that's not going to happen by following Adam Smith and letting the market do its thing. We need to actually have a plan that can help push this transition. At first, Hamilton is not particularly concerned with economics. He's writing about democracy and all that. When fighting begins, he organizes an artillery company and he serves for about a year on the front lines. And because he's so brilliant and good at what he does, he's receiving these offers from generals to join their staffs, and he holds out until Washington offers him a place on his quote-unquote family, which is to say his staff. So then Hamilton transitions to the role of a kind of military planner, and he has an overall view of the war. And what he sees is, one, total dysfunction at the level of politics because the colonies are not properly united. They're operating under the Articles of Confederation, which is just a loose security pact. And each colony is essentially a sovereign state. And so there's a continental army which answers to Congress, but there are also these militias, state militias. And so states would send aid to the continental army and put provisions on them, say, like, this clothing is for the Pennsylvania line. Please don't distribute this weaponry to whatever, the New England line, this kind of stuff. Congress had no means of taxing. So Hamilton is viewing all of this from this kind of Archimedean bird's eye view on Washington's staff.
So one of the things that comes through in your book, and again, I don't know much about this, but I didn't realize how much of a basket case the Revolutionary War kind of was, and how disorganized in some respects and just terrible physical conditions. So you write about how, there were soldiers who rebelled because they weren't getting paid because there were no taxes. So the federal government, which didn't really exist, could not pay them. And also how soldiers had to be let loose in the forest to slaughter wild pigs because they didn't have enough food supply. And things like that. It very much seems to highlight the idea or the importance of the role of the supply chain and physical, real goods in military conflict, and I guess by extension in government.
Absolutely. And I think many of us labor under misapprehension that the Revolutionary War was a guerrilla war and that the patriots were living off the land and, taking pot shots at the British from behind stone walls.
That's how we learned it when I was in elementary school.
Yeah, that's how I learned it. But actually, it was a conventional war, which is to say very expensive. And most of the conflicts were force on force with these long supply chains. Everything had to be provided to these armies. Salt, for example, something as mundane as salt. This was extremely important. As one old article said salt was as important to the Revolutionary War armies as gasoline was to the armies of 1945. If you didn't have salt for the animals, they would very quickly get weak and couldn't function. You had to cure food with salt. So salt was essential. There really wasn't a salt industry in the colonies because one of the few things that the British Navigation Acts, one of the weird little kind of wrinkles in them, was that they allowed ships coming from Europe to fill their hulls for ballast with French salt. So there was this flow of relatively cheap, high quality salt into the colonies. So the colonies didn't actually have much of a salt industry. So during the war, that's cut off. So they have to start developing a salt industry. They've got these anemic little foundries, one down in Virginia, some up in Pennsylvania. They have to start building all this up as the war is going on. And even though there were these long supply lines, things were so harsh that there was also what they called the grand forage, that soldiers would go out to requisition and nominally purchase supplies, but they're doing this with a series of increasingly worthless scripts. At first, you have the continental dollar, which the British are also counterfeiting, and then they just overproduce continental dollars so that they're worthless. Then they create this IOU system called Pierce's notes, which turn into another kind of paper currency. But these requisition squads would go out into the countryside and say to farmers, like, well, if you support the cause, we're here to buy with this worthless money, whatever, 10% of your produce, half your chickens, whatever. And if you refuse, then they say, well, you're a loyalist, you're against our cause, so we're just going to confiscate everything. So they're pushing all of this paper currency, which during the war leads to inflation, and then there's a big crash after the war. So it's totally chaotic. And the scale of some of these operations is nuts. There was a campaign in 1779 against the Iroquois, who had mostly sided with the British, and it involved damming a river, building a road to the river, building a fleet of boats to go down the river, and then blowing this dam and riding this wave of water down river to then launch on this expedition against the Iroquois. So capital intensive, labor intensive, big economic endeavor.
So one of the things that's interesting these days is, people have talked for years in the U.S. like, oh, we need to revive domestic manufacturing. And it's just one of those things that gets said. What seems to help get the votes over the line to actually do endeavors, even when it comes to something like climate, is the idea of existential national security threat. We have to compete against China, right? Like that's how it's framed. And when there's the rivalry with China as the framing, then that opens the door for votes. And it sounds like, and you talk about this in your book, that ultimately it was the same, that at the end, it's like there is no sovereign U.S. without manufacturing.
Yes.
That we can't maintain our independence, even if we win it, without manufacturing.
That was Hamilton's insight, that this independence would be totally illusory if it was not backed up with material force, and that material force was going to be expensive, and that required an economic transformation, an industrialization program, but they didn't use that word. They talked about manufacturers. So that's what he sets out to do. And amidst the war, he has a kind of what seems to be a mental breakdown. He goes into this nervous fever during the winter when they're all at Valley Forge, and there's a number of generals going rogue, and he's sent up to reimpose order. And then he has this crazy breakdown. And after that, his writing is really different. He begins a series of letters to elites outlining the need for constitutional convention and an economic plan. And so the rest of his life is that. And it should be said that the war ends in 1783. There are rebellions like increasing in the ranks, mutinies, culminating with a mutiny by officers in Newburgh, New York, which is often misrepresented as if these guys are all greedy and trying to, have some coup d'etat, but they are suffering like their men. I mean, they have boots. Some of their men are shoeless, but it's like they had really suffered, and they were demanding from Congress some resources. After the war, beginning in, the fighting kind of winds down around 1780, but the Treaty of Paris isn't until 1783. And there then begins what's called the critical period, which is a period in which the United States is still governed by the Articles of Confederation. and all sorts of serious economic and political and even military problems begin to happen. There's a trade war between New Jersey and New York and Connecticut. Maryland and Virginia are having similar trade wars on the Chesapeake. There's conflict with maroon communities, self-emancipated, formerly enslaved people, some of whom had served with the British Army, who have these autonomous communities on the border of South Carolina and Georgia. There's increasing conflict with Native Americans in what's now Kentucky. There's conflict between groups of white settlers and their speculative land backers, like these two competing factions in the Wyoming Valley of Pennsylvania, which it turns into a shooting war in which people are being killed and homes are burned. And then all of this culminates with Shays' Rebellion in 1786 in Western Massachusetts. And all of these states had gone heavily into debt during the war. And many of those IOUs that I mentioned earlier were bought up at pennies, on the dollar vis-a-vis their face value by speculators. And in Massachusetts, 35 people owned almost half of all of the state's debt. And Congress is making these requests. And in 1784, there's this massive requisition request, which by 1786 is really hurting people on the ground. And so this request for a tax take from Congress is part of what's pushing Massachusetts to shake down its farmers. There's also, interestingly, a series of volcanic eruptions, one in Iceland and one in Japan.
Oh, yeah, which affected the growing season, right?
Yeah. There's a really, really cold summers and floods knocking out crops and barns. So all this is happening.
We were barely hanging on in those days.
Yeah. And so amidst this, there's this massive wave of foreclosures in Massachusetts and also in New Hampshire and other parts of New England. But in Massachusetts, this coalesces into an actual armed rebellion led by veterans of the Revolutionary War, in particular, Daniel Shays. The Shaysites didn't call themselves Shaysites. They called themselves regulators. And what they did was they just closed down the courts. And the militia was called up to put an end to this, and the militia would switch sides or refuse to fight or just melt away. So the coastal elites who owned all the debt that they were trying to collect on by foreclosing on these farms create a private army. They take up a subscription of a private army, and there's actually a series of force-on-force battles with cannons, and the Shaysites are defeated in the early spring, winter of 1787. And it's in response to that crisis that the Constitutional Convention happens in Philadelphia. There's literally like
this is Hamilton. This is what Joe said Hamilton the musical was.
Right.
Okay. So can I just ask you can kind of see why Hamilton would make the argument that the U.S., such as it was at that time, needs to develop industrially, build out manufacturing capacity, create a strong system of government and things like that. But one thing I don't quite understand from that period is why was agrarianism seemingly so well regarded? Because it's hard for me to even envision a time when there was this agrarian ideal, because we're so used to talking about development, linear development of economies. You move from farming to manufacturing to a service-based economy. It's weird to think that at that time, there was actually a number of people who said that agrarianism was the best economic system.
Yes, most famous among them, Thomas Jefferson. Agrarianism was popular because that's what most people did. And Jefferson famously or infamously says in one correspondence that it would be better to leave manufacturing workshops in Europe because manufacturing brings with it a degradation of character and that the farming classes are the most noble. And so it was a very romantic argument about national character. Underneath that, though, was also a very material concern with what it would mean for the slave South were the North, where there was, at this point, at the end of the Revolution, slavery has been outlawed in Massachusetts. It's been outlawed in Vermont, which is not yet actually a state. It's on the way to being outlawed in Pennsylvania and New York. That'll take a couple more decades. But the Southern elite can see the writing on the wall that their system is unpopular. And if the North becomes more populous and wealthier, then it would dominate the federal government. This was their fear, and then perhaps come after their property. And that is indeed what happened. And part of what drove that northern hostility to slavery was humanitarian. It was like a sort of religious kind of humanitarian sensibility. But there was also an element of self-interest. Northern farmers were really worried that this system would crowd them out of Western lands and that it might extend to the north. They did not think, slavery is naturally limited to agrarian work on cotton and tobacco in the South. They were worried that the workers of the North could also be enslaved. That's just sort of just emerging at the time of the Revolution. So anyway, so that's part of what is motivating Jefferson's hostility initially to manufacturing and this romanticization of the agrarian character. It's also that they don't want the northern states to get too powerful. And so the Constitution actually involves all sorts of compromises to compensate for the fact that that's very likely to happen. The Senate being one of those important compromises where every state gets 2 senators. And the Southern elites dominated the Senate for a very long time. And it should be said, up until the Civil War, the richest people in the country were always Southern elites, even though the South was generally impoverished. And even to this day, the southeast of the U.S. bears the marks of underdevelopment in terms of numerous indicators of well-being, rates of interpersonal violence, early death, all this kind of stuff.
What did industrial policy, of which, again, I know they didn't call it that at the time, but like to Hamilton, what did it look like specifically? What should the federal government be empowered to do? How should it make those decisions? Like, okay, it's all philosophically, he criticized Adam Smith. He saw reasons on the ground why there needed to be a strong state to develop that. What does that look like in practice in terms of actual policy choices made by the government to foster these industries?
Well, all of that is laid out in the report on the subject of manufacturers. And he calls the things that the federal government should do the means proper. It should also be said that the report on manufacturers is the first time the word capitalist is used in the English language.
I was amazed to read that. So you said the first published mention of the word capitalist.
As far as I can tell, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. It had been used in French earlier, but that was the first time it's in English. So the means proper for Hamilton involve tariffs, prohibitive taxes on imports so as to defend infant industries, as they would later be called. Hamilton calls them infant manufacturers, but also drawbacks from those tariffs, subsidies for specific firms that need help, bans on exports of strategic raw materials, investment in physical infrastructure, investment in planning and in R&D, research and development, and general education. And ultimately, he wanted to have a planning board, something like the Japanese Ministry of Industry and Technology. That never came to fruition, but he lays out in tremendous detail, basically the means proper, this toolbox for economic planning. And the standard story is that it was shot down. He even opens the door to the idea of public ownership. He also, more well known, of course, and before pitching the manufacturing plan, he creates the credit system, right? He creates the First Bank of the United States. And the standard story is that, well, it came to nothing, but actually a bunch of it was passed. And over time, more and more of what Hamilton outlined in the Report on Manufacturers is implemented. And it's often implemented in moments of crises, because frequently what happens is the free marketeers win the argument. There isn't sufficient taxation, there isn't sufficient regulation, and then there's an economic crash and a crisis in which planning is sort of spontaneously summoned in to clean up the mess. So in the long run, the report on the subject of manufacturers really does triumph and does guide American industrialization, and was also very influential on other industrialization processes.
Can you talk about the relationship between Hamilton's vision of industrial policy, and again, he doesn't use that term, but the means proper, and I guess how it's financed? Because he seems to make, and obviously this is where I think a lot of what we're seeing from the Biden administration now tends to get a little bit controversial, because people say like, oh, well, we're building all this stuff, but also the public debt has absolutely exploded. What did Hamilton say about that aspect of it? And one thing that I was kind of thinking is he seems to talk a lot about external financing. So building up state credibility in order to convince creditors to give you money so that you could fund all these projects. And when I think about that, in addition to some of the like tariffs and bounties and subsidies that he was talking about, I don't want to say beggar thy neighbor policies, but like you start to think about, well, why would these other countries fund American development? And also, can everyone pursue these type of policies all at once? Can everyone draw on external debt in order to develop their own economies?
Well, taking the first part first. So what Hamilton does is all the states have debt. And so when he is Treasury Secretary, he's the first Treasury Secretary under Washington, he pursues assumption of the state debts, as it's called, so that the federal government will buy up at face value all these state debts, which will help reinflate the state economies and liberate the state governments from this debt. But in exchange, the states have to hand over their western land claims. And many states like didn't have a western boundary. It was just like, and you know, the western boundary of Virginia is
it's somewhere in that direction.
Yeah, we haven't been to the Pacific yet, but it's like out there as far as we can go.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, and so getting all of that land and federalizing it is also a very important part of the toolbox for American industrialization. So the way Hamilton pays for the debt is by taking a loan in Europe. And he offers 4% interest when most European debt is offering 3% interest. And there's a debate at the time about whether or not the debt should just be, you know, paid off. And Hamilton says, no, we need to, you know, this is
roll it over, essentially. You want to keep borrowing.
Yeah, what he calls a funded debt. So this is what happens. And part of this is also about keeping your enemies close. He doesn't want the speculator class to turn on the state and attack it and undermine it. He wants to deal them in. And critics say, oh, see, he was just a servant of these elites. And it's like, well, yeah, he was, you know, helping their interests. But he also was concerned very pragmatically about having this class of speculators turn against the state. And so he wanted them to be committed to state stability. Because I should say, he's very explicit about the risk of the country fragmenting and falling apart and disintegrating into civil war, which, you know, it does to some extent due to the power of states. So Hamilton was very opposed to state power. Anyway, so that's part of how he funds it. And then also, prior to the Washington administration, states had their own rules, and generally the tariff was around 8%. After Hamilton's plans go through, it's about 13%. The interesting thing is that the overall tax burden actually goes down.
Yeah, I made a note of this because I thought it was really interesting. And again, I think when people think about like public infrastructure building and industrial policy nowadays, they think like, oh, my taxes will go up. But in this particular instance, I think they fell 77% from 1785 to 1788.
Yeah, and that's partly because there wasn't this insane effort to just pay off all the debts, and also because there are productive investments being made. Another crucial piece of this toolbox is actually the post office.
Yeah, that was really interesting to me. Say more about that.
So in the postal clause, my favorite clause in the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution is very often overlooked, and that explains what the government can do. Most constitutional scholarship focuses on how the government works, the divided government, different branches. But what does this government allow itself to do is rarely explored. And so Article 1, Section 8 is where that is laid out. That's what Congress can do. And there's a debate around the postal clause. Benjamin Franklin and Hamilton and other Federalists, as they were called, they wanted to empower the federal government to build canals because they needed transportation infrastructure. And that is opposed by primarily Southerners. As is later said, some decades afterwards, when the question of canals, federally funded canals, again comes up, Daniel Macon, a congressman from Georgia, answers a young local politician who asks him, he says, how come we're opposed to the federal funding of canals? And Macon says, if we allow Congress to fund canals, they will no sooner and with more propriety soon be after our slaves. He doesn't say slaves, he's, you know, some euphemism. So there was, again, this concern, if, you know, the more you empower the federal government, the greater the risk to slavery. So there is no mention of canals. However, the postal clause says that the post office has the right to build post roads. And that little thing, roads, well, by the 1820s, most rivers were declared post roads.
Oh,
and,
brilliant.
and the post office becomes a massive public works agency. We think of rivers as passive natural features, but they required enormous amounts of transformation to be economically useful. And it was the post office that did that, hiring contractors. For example, on the Red River, which runs up through Arkansas, this is after Hamilton's time, but these are the effects of Hamilton's work playing out. There was a 100-mile-long snake-infested logjam called the Raft, and it blocked settlement of Arkansas and Missouri. And it was the federal government, i.e. the post office, that went in and cleared that. And so the post office built the vast majority of roads, and that lowered transportation costs, that knit together a national economy. It also subsidized business communications and the press and did enormous amount to create a national market.
That's incredibly interesting. And up until you talked about it in the book, I had not realized the sort of the developmental role for the post office. But I'm glad you said that thing about the young congressman. Why do we oppose allowing the federal government to have this role in the building of canals? And, there was concerns that the abolition movement was going to rise and their way of life and their economic system was going to get destroyed by the advent of slavery. There still is a lot of opposition to the idea that the federal government can have a productive role to play in building out infrastructure or doing whatever the equivalent is of building out a canal today. So are there deeper strains or other sort of related ideas that you can draw between, the late 1700s and today, excluding slavery, why there's still like economic interest of like deep anxiety about the role of the federal government in these things?
Yeah, I think persistent throughout American history is the fear of the slippery slope by the incumbent economic elites. And if the federal government is proposing transformations of any sort, there are always going to be some interests that are threatened by that. And the other thing is it's expensive. And so no one really wants to pay taxes. And so industries and lobbies are constantly pushing to lower taxes. And so part of the argument for that is don't spend the money. Don't do these big projects. Just give us the money. Let us keep the money. These big projects are pointless and we handle the money better.
In the few minutes remaining, can you please defend industrial policy from every single criticism that has ever been made against it? No, but I am thinking back to Adam Smith. And, Adam Smith's argument was partly one of security, the idea that trade would build relationships between countries, whereas Hamilton's argument, it seems, is centered on the development of the U.S., the building of a strong state, and how those two are related to each other. So I guess, number one, what does Hamiltonian-style industrial policy actually mean for trade relationships between countries and the prospects for peace? But then also, can you talk a little bit about arguments about, well, government spending creates unproductive capacity, or it's unfair for governments to pick winners or losers? Again, I'm asking you to basically address all the critiques of industrial policy in the few minutes we have allotted to us.
Well, the first thing I would say is it's not like industrial policy always works out. There are problems with it. It's not easy to do. However, if you look at the history of industrialization in one country after another, it does raise the standard of living and it generally works. But it always involves a developmentalist activist state. So I don't think there's any escaping that. Now, that can be done in better or worse ways. And the U.S. plays an important role in that. These ideas from Hamilton go to Frederick List, who goes to Germany, who then very influential on the Meiji Restoration in Japan and Japan's industrialization and on to today. But so in terms of, I think that's the most important argument, is that the actual story of industrialization always involves an activist state. In terms of trade, Hamilton was not opposed to trade. He just didn't want to be subordinated to this dominant power, the British. His concern with national sovereignty and industrial development didn't come at the expense of international trade. So almost always exports also play a very important part of industrialization. Take, for example, a place like Rwanda. Rwanda is very explicit, very kind of Hamiltonian. They say, look, if we don't have economic growth and development, we're going to have another genocide. We've had, 4 or 5, whatever it is, right? And they're heavily dependent on exporting tea. They don't want to not export tea, but they've had conflicts with the IMF because they want to run a 3% budget deficit so that they can fund public education all the way, through K through 12. And they say, look, if our farmers are all illiterate, we can't increase productivity and we can't develop. So I'm speaking to industrialization rather than industrial policy.
Sure.
Like what we're dealing with here in the U.S. is something new, which is kind of like the question of reindustrialization. And, that's actually a very different problem and project.
The book is written to the left. What did you feel the need for like this particular audience to read this particular history?
Well, there's a hostility, I think, to the U.S. projects on the left that is not helpful. And there's also a misunderstanding of the Constitution. I mean, people write off the Constitution as a document written by slaveholders. And I was struck in getting under the hood, about how many progressive elements there are in the American constitutional tradition. And I came away from this project with a much deeper appreciation and respect for that. And I wanted to disabuse leftists who fall into these sort of facile notions about the Constitution being bad. I disagree with that. And I think there's actually a lot of room for quote unquote progressive goals to be met through the Constitution. The general welfare clause, which Thomas Jefferson freaked out about and he didn't like. He said, this could mean almost anything. It's like, yes, it opens the door to all types of egalitarian projects potentially.
I have one more thing, which is, again, when I think about Hamilton's experience versus what's happening today, one of the things I think about is that, as you said, a lot of what he recommended didn't immediately come to fruition. People like Jefferson stood in the way. And nowadays, there seems to be, a sort of similar back and forth within DC. But how do you build political consensus for this type of policy? Because that really seems to have been the challenge for Hamilton. It happened over time to some degree, but it certainly didn't happen immediately. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know how you build political consensus around it. You don't do it by not admitting any fault and not having conversations. So I cannot tell you how political consent can be built.
But, I suppose you'll have to write a whole other book about that.
Yeah, I mean, and there are, well, you guys, I just listened to a podcast you did with some Irish guy about, the EU policies. Yeah. I mean, it's it's not like there aren't problems with these agendas, and those have to be acknowledged and those blockages removed.
That's what I was going to say, Tracy, when you said that, like, it seems so quaint that people are, like, skeptical of the arrow of economic trajectory. I was like, we just did this episode, and I felt like I had a lot of sympathy.
I know, but, like, if you read the book, like, the idealization of agrarianism is just, like, very surprising to me, especially because you think back to the late 1700s, and you don't think that, like, subsistence farming was a particularly glamorous activity, but then again, as Christian was pointing out, there's all this like idealism and values attached to the hard work of being a farmer
and the wealth of the
and that too. Yeah.
And it did provide autonomy for yeoman farmers. And so there were legitimate concerns about the loss of that autonomy. One final argument for industrial planning, for government intervention, is that it is, as Karl Polanyi says, laissez-faire, free trade was planned, and planning is spontaneous, because the pattern again and again is that the forces that want free market advocate for that. They get deregulation, they get tax cuts, and that inevitably leads to a crash in which the government has to step in and regulate and nationalize. And we just lived through that with 2008, right? I mean, you had an entire generation of bankers and policy experts who had argued against government intervention. And when 2008 came, what did they do? They basically nationalized the U.S. banking system for a number of years and bailed the whole thing out. So another argument for industrial policy is that government intervention in a capitalist economy is inevitable. It's going to either happen ad hoc during an emergency, or it can happen consciously through democratic deliberation.
Tracy, I really enjoyed that conversation. Even setting aside sort of some of the economic lessons, just sort of like revisiting some of the assumptions we make about the history of that time and what it was actually like, I find to be very useful.
Yeah, we didn't even really get into this, but there was also, I think, an instance of price controls immediately after the Revolutionary War. We're going to have to do like a whole other hour on this with Christian at some point.
Yeah, we should. There's another interesting thing, and I meant to ask a question about it, but I'm aware that there is a thing in American history called the War of 1812, and I almost know nothing about it. I certainly was not. I think they set the White House on fire.
Yeah.
That's all I know. But in the book, there's a lot in there about the basically insufficiency of the U.S. national defense at that point, born in part due to poor domestic investment that allowed us to be in a situation where the British could, destroy Washington, D.C.
It's funny. I didn't study or hear that much about the Revolutionary War, but when I went to university in London, there sure was a lot of talk in my international history class about the War of 1812.
That's so funny. Yeah, I literally realized I know very little about it, and I don't think it gets talked about very much.
I was waiting for you to drop the idea of Hamilton being a secret MMTer.
Clearly. I mean, come on. No, but it is really interesting. And, this idea of like that there were ways in the U.S. Constitution. And I thought that was a really interesting point that like embedded in the Constitution are these various clauses and comments or lines that really do open up a lot of like space for active economic power from the government.
Yeah. I also thought the point about, not just dismissing the some of the negativities that can go with industrial policy is really important because if you're going to, you can do it. You can also do it wrong, to Christian's point. And there are plenty of examples throughout world history of things kind of going off the rails and stuff like that. But you need to have a reasonable and honest discussion about the pros and cons and the goals of the policy as well. What exactly you're trying to do here and what the results are that you want to see. It can't just be like throw money at every single problem. You have to have some specificity about what you're trying to achieve.
Absolutely. And that's so fascinating because I knew that about like Friedrich List and the industrialization of Germany and the influence that his work in Germany then had on Japan. But the fact that his work actually draws to Hamilton, the fact that Hamilton was the first to write the word capitalist in the English language, pretty fascinating history.
Yeah, absolutely. Shall we leave it there?
Let's leave it there.